In tonight's quiet exploration, the narrative drifts through the long, gentle history of money, tracing its earliest forms from simple measures of grain to the first carved tokens and metal coins. It moves through landscapes of exchange, cooperation, and slow transformation, observing how communities shaped systems of value long before the rise of markets or states. This is a calm journey into the origins of currency, told at an unhurried pace, where ancient economies unfold like soft ripples across time. Long before coins rang softly in the hands of merchants, long before paper scrolls recorded lists of debts and agreements, and long before markets filled with the quiet murmur of trade, human communities lived in a world where value moved primarily through memory, trust, and the slow rhythms of daily cooperation. Small groups shared what they had according to season, need, and relationship. Grain was gathered, stored, and weighed with care. Livestock wandered across wide plains, providing wool, milk, and movement rather than abstract worth. In these early landscapes, the air carried the scent of earth freshly turned, of fire smoldering in the early hours of dawn, and of simple tasks repeated across generations without written records or formal systems. As populations grew and settlements expanded, the gentle balance of memory and mutual understanding became more challenging to maintain. Grain needed to be counted, labor needed to be tracked, and agreements between households began stretching across months and years rather than moments. Storage rooms filled with heavy sacks, pottery vessels, and carved wooden markers. Quiet negotiations happened in shaded courtyards, where the movement of goods required a shared method of measurement that could remain stable as communities became more complex. With every harvest and exchange, subtle ideas began forming. Ideas about equivalence, accountability, and the possibility that physical objects might record obligations more clearly than spoken words. In many early settlements, the earth itself held the first traces of this developing system. Clay tablets hardened in the sun contained impressions of grain and livestock, marked with simple symbols that represented agreements. Smooth stones carved with small patterns indicated quantities owed or received. These early tools did not yet resemble coins or currency, but they carried seeds of the concept, the notion that value could be represented, stored, and transferred in a form separate from the goods themselves. Over generations, these changes grew slowly but steadily, influenced by expanding trade routes, shifting climates, and increasing human networks. Across river valleys, plains, and coastal regions, communities began finding new ways to exchange labor and goods without requiring constant personal contact. Quietly, methodically, the first ideas of money began to take shape, not as a single invention, but as a long, gradual evolution shaped by the everyday needs of farmers, scribes, artisans, and travelers. It is into this early world of clay, grain, tokens, and measured trust that the narrative now moves, observing the soft beginnings of a system that would eventually shape economic life across continents. In the earliest settled communities, long before money took any recognizable shape, daily life moved according to rhythms set by land, season, and shared labor. Villages rose beside rivers where soil remained fertile and water flowed with dependable regularity. Mornings began with the low sounds of movement, footsteps on packed earth, the creak of wooden doors, the rustle of grain being poured from storage jars into baskets. The air often held the scent of damp clay walls warming slowly under the sun, mixed with smoke from small cooking fires that never fully went out. Food formed the center of nearly every routine. Fields of barley and wheat required constant attention, their growth tied closely to weather patterns that no one could control. Harvests were moments of quiet intensity rather than celebration, as communities worked steadily to gather grain before wind or rain could spoil it. Once collected, the grain was carried into shared storage spaces. Thick-walled rooms kept cool and dry, lined with jars sealed carefully against moisture and pests. Each jar represented not only nourishment, but time itself, months of future meals held in stillness. In these early villages, exchange happened through familiarity. Neighbors knew one another's needs and abilities. A potter provided vessels in return for grain. A herder shared milk or wool in exchange for labor during harvest. These exchanges were rarely immediate or equal in any precise sense. They unfolded gradually, tracked through memory and reinforced by repeated interaction. Trust functioned as an invisible ledger, maintained through reputation and long-standing relationships rather than numbers or marks. As populations slowly increased, these systems grew heavier to manage. More families meant more storage, more labor, and more agreements stretching across seasons rather than days. A farmer might lend grain to another household during a poor harvest, expecting repayment after the next growing cycle. A temple storehouse might distribute food to laborers maintaining irrigation canals, trusting that future harvests would replenish the supply. These arrangements required careful attention, and memory alone became less reliable as obligations multiplied. Scribes and administrators emerged quietly from these conditions, often attached to temples or communal centers. Their role was not yet powerful or prestigious. It was practical. They observed, recorded, and preserved information that could no longer remain safely in the mind alone. Clay tablets were pressed with symbols representing quantities of grain, livestock, or labor. These tablets were small, heavy, and unassuming, stored on shelves or stacked in baskets. Their surfaces bore the faint texture of fingers and reeds, reminders that human hands shaped each record. Daily life for most people remained unchanged on the surface. Fields were still plowed, animals were still tended, meals were still prepared with patience and repetition. Yet beneath these routines, a subtle transformation was underway. Value was beginning to separate from the object itself. Grain could now exist as a recorded quantity rather than a physical pile. Labor could be measured in time rather than effort alone. These ideas did not arrive suddenly. They settled in slowly, shaped by necessity rather than design. In workshops and courtyards, small objects began appearing alongside written records. Clay tokens shaped like cones, spheres, or discs represented specific amounts of goods. Each shape carried meaning understood within the community. A cone might signify a measure of barley. A sphere might represent livestock. These tokens were handled gently, counted, stored, and exchanged alongside verbal agreements. Their presence added weight to promises, providing something tangible to hold during negotiation. For common people, these developments felt distant, but increasingly present. A farmer might receive a token instead of immediate grain, trusting that it could later be exchanged at a storehouse. A laborer might work on a canal project and receive a mark on a tablet rather than food that day. Life continued as before, but the way obligations were remembered had changed. The quiet assurance of shared memory was now reinforced by clay, symbol, and mark. As days passed and seasons turned, these systems blended seamlessly into daily routine. There was no single moment when money was invented, no announcement marking its arrival. Instead, it emerged through repetition, each harvest recorded, each token counted, each agreement preserved. The sounds of village life remained soft and familiar. The scrape of tools, the murmur of voices, the low call of animals at dusk. But beneath them lay a growing structure of abstract value, slowly taking form within the calm patterns of everyday existence. As these early methods of recording and exchange settled into place, they began shaping behavior in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. People still rose with the light and returned to rest at dusk, but conversations now included references to quantities that existed beyond immediate sight. A family might speak of grain owed after the next harvest, or of labor counted in days rather than gestures of goodwill. These references were spoken calmly, without tension, as part of a growing shared understanding that obligations could persist quietly across time. Storage spaces became centers of both physical and symbolic importance. Large jars stood in rows, their rounded forms cool to the touch, each sealed with care. Nearby, tablets were stacked methodically, their surfaces marked with simple impressions. The weight of these tablets was reassuring, grounding abstract promises in something that could be held. In these rooms, the air was still and slightly cool, carrying the faint scent of clay and grain dust. The silence within them contrasted with the open fields outside, reinforcing the sense that something lasting was being preserved. For laborers working on communal projects, irrigation canals, walls, or paths, payment no longer always came immediately. Instead, work was acknowledged through records that promised future provision. This system allowed larger undertakings to unfold without interruption, sustained by trust, reinforced through record keeping. The work itself remained slow and physical, hands pressing into wet earth, feet sinking into mud, tools moving with patient rhythm. Yet the reward had shifted slightly, resting in expectation rather than immediate exchange. Over time, these practices reduced the need for constant negotiation. A token or tablet could speak quietly on behalf of its holder, carrying information without requiring explanation. This eased interactions between people who were less familiar with one another, travelers, traders, or distant relatives. Exchanges became calmer, less dependent on personal memory. Value began to move independently, guided by agreed symbols rather than direct familiarity. As trade extended beyond village boundaries, these systems proved especially useful. Goods moved along rivers and paths, connecting distant settlements. Grain traveled in measured portions. Metals, shells, and textiles passed through many hands before reaching their final destination. In each exchange, some form of record or token accompanied the goods, maintaining continuity across distance. These objects absorbed the dust and wear of travel, yet their meanings remained intact, understood by those who shared the system. Despite these changes, daily life retained its quiet consistency. Meals were simple and repetitive. Children learned tasks by watching elders. Stories were shared in the evening, and concerns about harvests or weather returned with each season. The emerging system of value did not disrupt these rhythms. Instead, it settled alongside them, offering structure without demanding attention. Gradually, the idea that value could exist separately from objects became familiar. A tablet might represent grain not yet harvested. A token might signify labor not yet completed. These representations allowed planning beyond the immediate present, opening space for larger communities and more complex cooperation. The change was not dramatic. It was steady, shaped by repetition and acceptance. In this way, money began not as coins or markets, but as a quiet extension of trust, given form through clay, symbols, and shared understanding. It arose from the everyday needs of people tending fields, building canals, and preparing for seasons yet to come. Its origins lay not in ambition, but in patience, order, and the calm desire to remember what could no longer be held entirely in the mind. With these foundations set gently into place, the story now turns toward moments and figures where these early systems became more defined, shaped further by institutions, authority, and expanding exchange, moving slowly into the next chapter of this long evolution. As these early systems of record and exchange settled quietly into daily life, they began to attract greater attention from those responsible for maintaining order within growing communities. What had started as simple marks in clay and modest tokens of obligation slowly gathered importance as settlements expanded and cooperation reached beyond immediate neighbors. In this gradual shift, certain places and figures emerged as steady centers of economic memory: temples, storehouses, and the individuals who oversaw them. The narrative now drifts toward one such world, where money-like systems took clearer shape through administration, ritual, and careful oversight. In the fertile river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, life unfolded beneath wide skies and along slow-moving water. Cities rose from the plain in layers of sun-baked brick, their walls blending softly with the surrounding earth. At the heart of these cities stood temples, not only as spiritual centers, but as hubs of storage, distribution, and record-keeping. These structures were quiet but imposing, their courtyards filled with the muted sounds of footsteps, murmured instructions, and the steady movement of goods. Within these temple complexes worked scribes, figures whose lives were shaped by patience and precision. Their days passed in shaded rooms where light filtered through narrow openings, illuminating rows of clay tablets arranged with care. Each tablet carried impressions made with a reed stylus, marking quantities of grain, dates, oil, or livestock. The scribe's hands moved slowly and deliberately, pressing symbols into damp clay before setting the tablets aside to dry. Their work required calm attention rather than creativity, repetition rather than speed. One such scribe, unnamed yet representative of many, lived a life defined by routine. Each morning began before the heat grew heavy as he walked along narrow streets toward the temple. The air carried the scent of dust and water drawn from canals. Vendors arranged goods in the marketplace nearby, while laborers gathered for assignments tied to irrigation, construction, or transport. The scribe observed these movements without urgency, aware that his task was to transform physical activity into lasting record. Inside the temple, the scribe received reports from overseers: how much grain had been collected, how much distributed, how much reserved for future seasons. These reports were spoken softly, then translated into symbols that would endure beyond the moment. The tablets did not circulate widely among common people. yet their influence reached far. They governed how food was allocated during lean months, how workers were compensated for their time, and how obligations between institutions were maintained. Over time, these records created a quiet form of stability. People trusted that grain stored in temple granaries was accounted for, that labor recorded would be acknowledged, that future needs had been considered. This trust was not abstract. It was reinforced by the physical presence of tablets, seals, and tokens, objects that could be touched, counted, and reviewed. Value, once bound to immediate exchange, now existed in an organized system, overseen by human hands and preserved in clay. The scribe's life was not marked by wealth or power in the modern sense. His clothing was simple, his meals modest, his dwelling unremarkable. Yet his role placed him at the center of an important transformation. Through his daily work, value became something that could be stored, transferred, and recalled with consistency. The slow accumulation of records created a memory larger than any individual, allowing the city itself to function as a coordinated whole. As seasons passed and generations followed, the influence of such figures grew steadily. What began as practical administration laid the groundwork for more formal systems of value, authority, and exchange. In the quiet rooms where tablets dried and shelves filled, the foundations of money were being shaped, not through ambition or spectacle, but through steady repetition and careful attention. As the years moved forward in measured cycles of flood and harvest, the work of record-keeping grew more layered and precise. The temple complexes expanded their storage rooms, adding new shelves and alcoves where tablets were arranged according to season and purpose. Some recorded daily distributions of bread and beer to laborers. Others tracked long-term obligations between distant cities. The rooms themselves were quiet, filled with the faint scrape of stylus on clay and the soft thud of tablets being set into place. Time seemed to slow within these spaces, shaped by repetition and careful order. The scribe's training had been long and exacting. As a younger apprentice, he had spent years learning symbols whose meanings were agreed upon across the region. Each mark carried weight, not because it was beautiful, but because it was understood. A single impression could represent a full measure of barley, a day of labor, or a share owed at a later date. Errors were corrected patiently, smoothed over with damp clay, and re-impressed with care. Accuracy mattered more than speed, and memory was reinforced through constant practice rather than inspiration. Beyond the temple walls, traders began to rely on these systems as they traveled between settlements. Boats drifted along canals carrying grain, textiles, and jars of oil, each shipment accompanied by tablets or sealed tokens that confirmed quantity and ownership. These objects moved calmly from hand to hand, inspected briefly, then stored again until needed. Their presence reduced uncertainty, allowing exchanges to occur between people who had never met and would never meet again. In the marketplace, the influence of these records was subtle but present. Goods were still displayed openly, and exchanges often involved conversation and negotiation. Yet beneath these interactions lay an understanding that value could be referenced elsewhere, confirmed by records held in storage rooms or temples. A trader might accept a promise marked on clay rather than immediate goods, trusting that the system behind it would hold. This trust did not arise overnight. It developed slowly, reinforced by countless small exchanges that unfolded without conflict. Authority also began to intertwine with these practices. Leaders relied on records to manage resources, plan construction projects, and distribute food during periods of scarcity. Decisions were made not only through judgment, but through reference to stored information. Tablets became tools of governance, shaping policies that affected entire populations. Still, the process remained quiet. There were no dramatic proclamations, only steady administration carried out through routine and repetition. The scribe observed these changes from his place within the system. His work connected him indirectly to distant fields, workshops, and river crossings. Though he rarely left the city, his records traveled widely, influencing decisions far beyond his sight. In this way, his daily labor contributed to a network of exchange that spanned regions and generations. Money, still unformed as coin or currency, existed here as an evolving structure of trust, memory, and agreed meaning. As cities grew larger and more interconnected, the need for consistency increased. Symbols were standardized, measures refined, and seals introduced to prevent alteration. Each refinement brought greater stability, allowing value to circulate with fewer interruptions. The process was gradual, unfolding across decades rather than moments. It reflected the same patience found in agriculture and construction, a belief that slow accumulation created lasting foundations. As these systems matured, they began to outgrow the spaces that had first contained them. What had once been manageable within a single temple or city gradually extended across wider regions, linking distant settlements through shared practices of measurement and record. Tablets now referenced not only local harvests, but obligations between cities separated by long journeys along rivers and desert paths. Each connection rested on the same quiet principle, that value could be trusted when it was carefully recorded and commonly understood. The scribe's role evolved alongside this expansion. His work increasingly involved reviewing older records, comparing quantities across seasons, and ensuring continuity between past agreements and present needs. Shelves filled with tablets that carried the weight of many years, their edges worn smooth by handling. Some tablets bore seals impressed by officials whose authority was recognized far beyond the city walls. These seals added another layer of assurance, marking records as legitimate and unaltered. The presence of such marks reinforced confidence in the system, allowing value to travel farther with fewer doubts. Outside the administrative spaces, the effects of these developments were felt gently but persistently. Laborers received standardized rations, their portions measured consistently, rather than negotiated individually. Artisans exchanged goods with an increasing sense of predictability, aware that the records supporting their work were stable. Farmers planned future planting based on obligations already recorded, trusting that promised grain or tools would arrive when needed. Life retained its familiar rhythms, yet these rhythms were now supported by a framework that extended beyond personal memory. Gradually, certain materials began to take on special significance within these systems. Silver, valued for its durability and divisibility, was weighed and recorded alongside grain and livestock. Though not yet minted into coins, it functioned as a portable representation of value, easier to transport than sacks of produce. Small ingots or fragments were measured carefully, their weight confirmed against known standards. These pieces moved quietly through the economy, bridging gaps between different forms of wealth and exchange. The transition toward such materials did not replace earlier practices immediately. Grain remained central, as did labor and livestock. Instead, these elements coexisted, forming a layered system where value could be expressed in multiple ways depending on context. This flexibility allowed the economy to adapt without disruption, absorbing new forms gradually rather than abruptly. Money, still in its early stages, was becoming more abstract, yet it remained grounded in tangible substances and trusted institutions. For the scribe, these changes marked the culmination of a lifetime spent recording the movements of value. His role, though modest in appearance, had helped shape a system capable of sustaining complex societies. Through countless tablets and careful marks, he and others like him transformed exchange from a series of personal agreements into an enduring structure that supported cities, trade networks, and long-term planning. As the careful work of record-keeping settled into the foundations of growing societies, the nature of value began to shift once again. What had started as a practical solution for managing grain, labor, and obligation slowly gathered meanings that reached beyond administration alone. The marks pressed into clay and the measured weights of silver were no longer just tools of organization. They became symbols of trust, authority, and shared belief. Over time, these symbols entered daily thought, shaping how communities understood fairness, balance, and exchange. In this quiet transformation, money moved from the hands of scribes into the realm of culture itself, where its presence invited reflection, ritual, and lingering questions, opening the way toward deeper mysteries that now unfold. As systems of value became embedded within daily life, they began to leave traces that extended beyond written records and measured exchange. These traces settled quietly into the ground, into ritual spaces, and into habits of thought that outlasted the people who first shaped them. Long after tablets crumbled and storehouses fell silent, the cultural meanings attached to early money continued to echo, partly preserved, partly obscured, and often surrounded by quiet uncertainty. Archaeological remains offer the first soft clues. Beneath layers of soil in ancient settlements, fragments of clay tablets appear alongside broken jars, seals, and small-shaped tokens. These objects rest together without clear separation between the practical and the symbolic. A token might once have represented a fixed quantity of grain, yet its placement within a household shrine suggests another purpose entirely. Some were pierced and worn, smoothed by touch over many years, hinting that they carried meaning beyond accounting alone. Their exact role remains uncertain, suspended between function and belief. In some regions, tokens were buried deliberately beneath floors or near entrances, placed with care rather than discarded. This positioning suggests acts of intention, perhaps to invite prosperity, perhaps to ensure balance, or perhaps simply to mark continuity between past and future. The lack of written explanation leaves only patterns to observe. Repetition across sites implies shared understanding, yet the details remain just beyond reach. Money, at this stage, existed not only as a system of exchange, but as an object capable of holding quiet significance. Ritual spaces reveal further complexity. In temple courtyards and ceremonial buildings, Offerings sometimes included measured quantities of grain or silver, recorded precisely and presented with solemn attention. These offerings were not payments in the modern sense. They were acts of alignment, gestures meant to harmonize human activity with cosmic order. Value here was symbolic, representing balance rather than accumulation. The act of measuring itself carried meaning, suggesting that order could be maintained through careful proportion. Across different cultures, similar patterns emerged independently. In river valleys, coastal settlements, and inland plains, early systems of value developed alongside rituals concerned with fertility, time, and renewal. This convergence raises questions that archaeology alone cannot fully answer. Did the concept of money shape belief, or did belief shape the form money took? The evidence suggests a gradual intertwining rather than a clear origin. Exchange and meaning grew together, each reinforcing the other through daily repetition. Burial practices offer another quiet window into these early perceptions. In some graves, small quantities of metal or tokens were placed near the body, arranged with intention rather than utility. These objects were no longer meant to circulate. Their presence suggests an understanding of value that extended beyond life, hinting at beliefs where exchange continued in another form. The exact interpretation remains uncertain, yet the pattern itself reveals how deeply value had entered the symbolic imagination. Even the act of weighing carried cultural resonance. Stone weights carved with simple markings were often treated with care, stored separately from everyday tools. Their consistency mattered, not only for trade, but for maintaining trust in the order of things. To alter a weight was to disrupt balance, an act viewed with quiet seriousness. In this way, physical measures became moral instruments, embodying ideals of fairness and stability. Over generations, these associations accumulated slowly. Money was no longer just a convenience. It was a language through which communities expressed ideas about obligation, harmony, and continuity. Yet much of this language remains only partially understood. Symbols survive without explanation, contexts fade, and interpretations shift with each new discovery. What remains is a sense that early money occupied a space between the material and the intangible, a space where practical necessity met cultural meaning. As excavations continue and comparisons deepen, these mysteries persist without urgency. They invite contemplation rather than resolution, reminding us that the origins of money were not only technical, but deeply human, shaped by belief as much as by need. This quiet complexity carries forward, leading gently into further reflections on how value became entwined with power, status, and social structure, unfolding slowly in the layers that follow. As excavation layers deepen, the physical remains of early value systems reveal patterns that suggest long periods of use, reuse, and reinterpretation. Objects once designed for counting or exchange were not always discarded when their practical function ended. Instead, they were often reshaped, polished, or placed into new contexts. A fragment of silver, too worn for precise measurement, might be hammered thin and wrapped in cloth. A broken token might be set into a wall or tucked into a foundation deposit. These choices indicate an enduring respect for the materials themselves, as though value lingered even after function faded. In domestic spaces, traces of early accounting appear in unexpected places. Tablets bearing tallies of grain have been found near hearths, stored alongside cooking vessels rather than administrative tools. Their proximity to daily life suggests that the recording of value was not distant or abstract, but woven gently into household routine. These records may have served as reminders, quiet markers of future obligation or shared responsibility, kept close to where food was prepared and distributed. Symbols carved into seals deepen the mystery further. Animals, plants, geometric shapes, and celestial forms appear repeatedly, pressed into clay alongside records of exchange. The repetition of these images implies shared meanings that extended beyond identification alone. A seal did more than authenticate. It carried identity, belief, and perhaps protection. When impressed upon a tablet, it transformed a simple record into a statement of legitimacy, grounded in both authority and symbolism. The seal's image lingered even after the tablet's immediate purpose passed, preserving fragments of a worldview that valued balance and continuity. In some cultures, the act of counting itself became ritualized. Measures were recited aloud during exchange, their rhythm steady and deliberate. The repetition reinforced accuracy, but it also imbued the process with solemnity. Counting was not rushed. Each number carried weight, spoken clearly, marking a transition from abundance to scarcity, from promise to fulfillment. These spoken measures echoed through marketplaces and storerooms, shaping soundscapes where value was heard as much as seen. The transition from organic materials to metal further complicates interpretation. Metal objects endure where grain and wood decay, leaving an uneven archaeological record. This durability can suggest greater importance than may have existed at the time. A silver fragment survives centuries, while a sack of barley leaves no trace. Yet both may have held equal value within their original context. This imbalance challenges modern interpretation, reminding us that what survives is not always what mattered most. Across regions, weights and measures reveal remarkable consistency. Stones of nearly identical mass appear in settlements separated by long distances. Such alignment implies shared standards maintained through communication and trust rather than enforcement alone. How these standards spread remains uncertain. They may have traveled with merchants, been taught through apprenticeship, or been reinforced through ritual gatherings. Whatever the method, the result was a quiet network of agreement extending across landscapes. The mystery deepens when considering moments of transition. In layers where older systems give way to newer ones, objects appear together that represent different stages of value. Tokens rest beside metal fragments. Tablets appear alongside early stamped marks. These layers do not suggest abrupt replacement, but gradual overlap. Communities did not abandon familiar practices suddenly. Instead, they experimented gently, adopting new forms while retaining older ones until confidence grew. Interpretation remains cautious. Without written explanation, meaning must be inferred through pattern rather than certainty. Each discovery adds texture rather than clarity, expanding understanding while leaving questions intact. The absence of definitive answers does not weaken the significance of these findings. Instead, it reflects the nature of early money itself, fluid, adaptive, and shaped by human choice rather than fixed design. Through these fragments, early money emerges as a cultural phenomenon as much as an economic one. It occupied spaces between ritual and routine, between belief and necessity. Its traces invite reflection on how humans assign meaning to objects, how systems gain authority through repetition, and how value becomes embedded within collective memory. These reflections settle gently into the next layer of understanding, where value begins to interact more visibly with hierarchy, leadership, and social distinction. As these early systems of value continued to unfold across generations, they began to shape the ways communities remembered themselves. Objects once tied to exchange gradually entered the realm of memory, becoming markers of continuity rather than instruments of calculation. In abandoned settlements, tokens and weights were sometimes gathered together and placed deliberately, not scattered as refuse, but arranged as if acknowledging their role in sustaining life over long spans of time. These quiet acts suggest an awareness that value had been more than utility. It had been a companion to survival, cooperation, and order. In some regions, later traditions preserved faint echoes of these early meanings. Stories spoke of balanced measures as symbols of justice, of honest weight as a sign of harmony between people. Though the original context had faded, the association remained. Fairness became inseparable from measurement. Stability became linked to consistency. These ideas, rooted in early systems of exchange, passed gently into moral language and social expectation, long after their material origins were forgotten. Archaeological uncertainty remains central to this period. No single artifact explains how money came to carry such layered meaning. Instead, meaning emerges through accumulation, through patterns observed across sites, cultures, and centuries. The lack of direct explanation allows space for reflection rather than conclusion. Early money appears not as a finished concept, but as a living practice, shaped continuously by those who used it. Its form shifted according to need, belief, and environment, leaving behind traces that resist simple interpretation. This ambiguity reflects the human condition itself. The impulse to measure, record, and exchange arose alongside the impulse to ritualize, symbolize, and remember. Neither existed in isolation. Value became meaningful because it was shared, repeated, and trusted. Its power lay not in the objects themselves, but in the collective agreement that surrounded them, an agreement sustained quietly through daily life. As the echoes of these early practices settle into stillness, attention begins to move outward once more. Beyond mystery and belief, value increasingly shaped visible social boundaries, influencing leadership, status, and the organization of communities. The foundations laid through ritual and record now supported broader structures, where exchange intersected with authority and hierarchy, guiding the narrative gently toward the next unfolding layer. As these quiet traces of belief and meaning faded gently into the deeper layers of time, the role of value continued to shift. What had once lived mostly in ritual spaces, household routines, and shared memory now began to surface more clearly within the visible structure of society. Measures of grain, metal, and labor did more than sustain communities. They helped define roles, influence leadership, and shape the boundaries between common life and positions of authority. In this gradual transformation, value moved from the symbolic toward the social, preparing the way for a world where wealth, status, and responsibility became increasingly intertwined. As systems of value became more stable and widely understood, they began to shape the social landscape in ways that were visible yet rarely dramatic. Distinctions emerged quietly, defined not by sudden displays of wealth, but by access, responsibility, and proximity to stored resources. In growing settlements, certain spaces carried a different atmosphere, cooler, more orderly, and carefully maintained. These were the residences of administrators, priests, and local leaders whose lives unfolded closer to granaries, treasuries, and record rooms. Within these spaces, daily routines differed subtly from those of common households. Floors were swept more often, storage vessels arranged with precision, and objects of exchange kept nearby rather than at a distance. Metal weights rested on smooth surfaces, tablets were stacked in careful sequences, and seals were stored in small containers lined with cloth. The handling of these items was deliberate and restrained, reflecting an understanding that they represented not only material value, but social responsibility. Touching them required permission, knowledge, and trust. Meals within elite households were not always richer, but they were more predictable. Access to recorded stores ensured stability through uncertain seasons. Grain allocations arrived on schedule, measured carefully and noted without fanfare. This consistency created a quiet separation between those whose lives depended on the immediate success of each harvest and those whose positions allowed them to rely on stored abundance. The difference was not marked by excess, but by assurance. Authority grew alongside this assurance. Leaders did not rule solely through command. They governed through oversight of resources. Decisions about distribution shaped loyalty and cooperation more effectively than force. When labor was required for large projects, walls, canals, or ceremonial spaces, records ensured that contributions were acknowledged and provisions supplied. The process unfolded calmly, supported by the quiet presence of value systems that coordinated effort without constant negotiation. Ritual also played a role in reinforcing social structure. Offerings made by elites were carefully measured, presented publicly, and recorded for remembrance. These acts demonstrated alignment with cosmic order and communal well-being. By participating visibly in such practices, leaders affirmed their role as stewards rather than owners of value. The distinction mattered. Wealth displayed openly risked disruption, while wealth managed responsibly fostered stability. Clothing and adornment reflected this restrained approach. Materials might be finer, metals more polished, yet ornamentation remained symbolic rather than extravagant. Rings, seals, and weights served practical purposes, while also signaling status through familiarity rather than display. Recognition came from knowing how to use these objects correctly, not merely possessing them. Over time, these patterns solidified into expectations. Children raised within elite households learned early to read symbols, understand measures, and observe the careful handling of resources. Their education emphasized patience, accuracy, and restraint. Mistakes were corrected quietly, reinforcing the idea that value systems demanded calm attention rather than haste. Through this process, social roles were reproduced gently across generations. The separation between common and elite life thus grew not through spectacle, but through proximity to systems of value. Those who managed resources occupied spaces where abstraction met daily practice, shaping decisions that affected entire communities. This quiet authority rested on trust, sustained by consistency, setting the foundation for more complex hierarchies that continued to evolve as societies expanded further. As these roles became more defined, The spaces occupied by elites took on an atmosphere of careful separation without complete isolation. Courtyards opened inward rather than outward, designed to keep activity contained and orderly. Light entered through narrow openings, illuminating stone floors and plastered walls with a steady, muted glow. The sounds within these spaces were restrained. Measured footsteps, low conversation, the soft placement of objects onto tables, reflecting a culture shaped by deliberation rather than urgency. Within administrative buildings, time moved at a different pace. Decisions were rarely rushed. Records were reviewed slowly, sometimes more than once, to ensure continuity with earlier agreements. A tablet from years past might be lifted carefully, its surface inspected for seal impressions and markings, then returned to its place. These acts connected present authority to past responsibility, reinforcing legitimacy through preservation rather than proclamation. Social gatherings among elites followed similar patterns. Meals were occasions for quiet discussion rather than display. Food was shared evenly, portions measured with the same attention applied to public distribution. Conversation often turned toward practical matters, upcoming harvests, maintenance of canals, exchanges with neighboring settlements, spoken calmly without visible strain. The atmosphere emphasized stability, projecting reassurance both inward and outward. The presence of value systems influenced personal conduct as well. Those entrusted with oversight learned to regulate their own desires, understanding that visible indulgence could undermine trust. Restraint became a form of virtue. To be seen as reliable meant demonstrating balance in all things: speech, movement, and consumption. This expectation shaped posture, gesture, and even silence, cultivating a demeanor that aligned authority with calm. Outside these spaces, common people observed these behaviors indirectly. They did not enter record rooms or storage halls, yet they sensed the order maintained within them. Deliveries arrived when expected. Allocations followed established patterns. In times of difficulty, distribution continued without disruption. These experiences reinforced acceptance of the social structure, not through admiration, but through familiarity and predictability. Education within elite circles reflected the importance of continuity. Instruction focused on repetition and imitation rather than innovation. Young administrators learned to replicate existing measures precisely, copying symbols until muscle memory formed. Creativity was discouraged in record-keeping. Consistency was valued above all. This approach ensured that systems remained stable even as individuals changed. Over time, certain families became closely associated with these roles. Their names appeared repeatedly in records, their seals recognized across settlements. This repetition did not necessarily confer luxury, but it established lineage as a source of trust. Authority became hereditary not through wealth accumulation, but through accumulated reliability. Each generation inherited not only position, but expectation. As societies continued to grow, these elite structures expanded in complexity, yet retained their core emphasis on balance and order. Value systems provided the framework through which leadership operated quietly, guiding social life without spectacle. The contrast between elite and common experience remained subtle, rooted in access and responsibility rather than excess, shaping a social landscape that appeared calm even as it grew increasingly layered. As generations passed, these patterns settled into something resembling permanence. The structures that supported elite life, granaries, record rooms, and meeting spaces, became enduring features of the landscape. Built with thicker walls and more deliberate design, they conveyed stability through their very presence. Their entrances were modest, their interiors orderly, reinforcing the idea that authority resided not in spectacle, but in continuity. These spaces changed little over time, even as the world beyond them slowly evolved. Within this framework, value shaped not only governance, but identity. Those who lived close to systems of exchange came to understand themselves as guardians of balance. Their responsibilities extended beyond material oversight into the realm of social harmony. When disputes arose, records were consulted rather than force applied. Agreements were referenced, measured, and restored through calm deliberation. The authority to interpret these records granted influence that was subtle yet far-reaching, guiding outcomes without visible assertion. Ceremonial occasions further reinforced this relationship between value and status. During seasonal festivals or communal rituals, elites often played visible but restrained roles. They supervised offerings, ensured proportions were correct, and confirmed that distributions aligned with tradition. Their participation symbolized continuity between past and present, linking current abundance to earlier promises. These moments were marked by quiet attention rather than celebration, emphasizing order over emotion. Material distinctions remained present but understated. Certain metals, fabrics, or tools appeared more frequently within elite households, yet their use followed convention rather than indulgence. Objects were maintained carefully, repaired rather than replaced, and passed down across generations. Their value lay as much in their history as in their material composition. This approach fostered a sense of stewardship, reinforcing the belief that resources existed to be preserved, not exhausted. Over time, the separation between elite and common life became embedded in expectation rather than enforcement. Children grew into roles shaped by their surroundings, absorbing the rhythms of responsibility or labor through observation. Social mobility remained possible, but rare, occurring through demonstrated reliability rather than accumulation. Trust remained the central currency, reinforced by consistent behavior across long periods. As societies expanded further, these early elite structures provided models for larger institutions that would emerge later. Palaces, treasuries, and courts inherited the same emphasis on order, measurement, and restraint. Though scale increased, the underlying principles remained recognizable. Value continued to serve as the quiet foundation upon which authority rested, linking leadership to responsibility rather than dominance. With this layer of social organization in place, attention begins to move once more toward broader connections. Beyond households and hierarchies, systems of value shaped interaction across landscapes, guiding movement, exchange, and the flow of resources between distant regions. These expanding networks carried value outward, preparing the way for a wider world shaped by trade, environment, and gradual interconnection. As the quiet structures of authority settled into daily life, value no longer remained confined to storerooms, record halls, or the spaces of leadership alone. It began to move outward, carried gently across fields, rivers, and distant paths. What had once served primarily to organize local communities now connected regions separated by long stretches of land and water. Through this gradual outward motion, systems of exchange extended beyond social boundaries, shaping landscapes, travel, and the slow circulation of goods and ideas. From this widening horizon emerged a world linked not by sudden expansion, but by steady movement and shared understanding. Across plains and river valleys, the movement of goods followed the pace of nature rather than urgency. Caravans did not hurry. Boats drifted with currents, guided more by patience than force. Along these routes, exchange unfolded quietly, marked by familiarity and repetition. Traders carried items that were light enough to travel far yet valuable enough to justify the journey. Small pieces of metal, woven cloth, dried goods, and symbolic objects whose worth had been agreed upon through shared systems of measure. The paths themselves became part of the exchange. Dust settled into footprints worn smooth by countless travelers. Stones placed deliberately along routes marked distances or resting places. In these spaces, value was not abstract. It took shape through movement, effort, and time. Each journey reflected an understanding that exchange required endurance rather than speed. Goods arrived slowly, their presence anticipated long before they appeared. At river crossings, temporary gatherings formed. Boats were unloaded, loads inspected, and records reviewed where applicable. Conversations remained calm, focused on verification rather than negotiation. A weight was checked, a mark confirmed, a seal recognized. These simple actions reinforced trust between people who might meet only once or twice in a lifetime. Value acted as a shared language, reducing the need for extended explanation. Environmental conditions shaped these exchanges deeply. Seasonal floods determined when routes opened or closed. Winds influenced coastal travel. Droughts altered the flow of goods, shifting emphasis from abundance to conservation. In response, systems of value adapted quietly. Measures were adjusted, storage increased, and expectations recalibrated. These changes did not disrupt exchange. They refined it, allowing trade to continue within the limits set by the land. Local economies remained grounded in necessity. Grain, livestock, and labor still formed the foundation of value. Long-distance exchange added layers rather than replacing these elements. Exotic materials carried symbolic importance, yet they entered daily life sparingly. Their presence signaled connection rather than wealth, reminding communities that they were part of a wider world shaped by shared practice. As these networks expanded, they remained remarkably fragile. A broken route, an impassable river, or a prolonged environmental shift could slow movement significantly. Yet rather than collapse, exchange adapted. Routes shifted. Goods were substituted. Systems of value allowed flexibility without chaos, maintaining continuity even as conditions changed. Through this steady expansion, exchange became less personal yet more reliable. People trusted systems rather than individuals, measures rather than memory. Still, the pace remained gentle. Nothing moved faster than could be sustained. Value traveled at the speed of human endurance, shaped by footsteps, flowing water, and the quiet resolve to maintain connection across distance. This outward movement of exchange continued, unfolding gradually into broader networks that reshaped economies and perceptions alike, leading further into the layered world that follows. As routes lengthened and familiarity grew, exchange began to settle into patterns that felt almost natural as though they had always existed. Certain paths were favored not because they were shorter, but because they were reliable. Wells stood where travelers expected them. Resting places appeared at intervals shaped by the limits of human movement. Over time, these routes gained quiet reputations, spoken of in low tones and remembered through experience rather than map or marker. Value moved along these paths with the same predictability, arriving slowly, departing gently, and leaving little disturbance behind. In the spaces between settlements, temporary marketplaces emerged without permanent structure. Cloth was spread on the ground, goods arranged carefully, and measures brought out for inspection. The atmosphere remained calm, almost subdued. Exchanges were brief and methodical. Items were weighed, counted, or compared against familiar standards. Once agreement was reached, goods changed hands without ceremony. There was little need for prolonged discussion. The shared understanding of value carried the interaction forward with minimal effort. Over time, certain materials gained prominence because they traveled well. Metals resisted decay. Textiles folded easily. Dried goods endured long journeys. These qualities made them useful not only for trade, but for storing value across distance and time. Their circulation encouraged wider participation in exchange, connecting regions that differed greatly in climate, resources, and custom. Through these interactions, local practices absorbed external influences quietly, adapting without erasing their origins. River systems played a particularly important role in this expansion. Waterways allowed heavier goods to move with less effort, linking inland communities to distant coasts. Boats drifted downstream, carrying grain, stone, and crafted items, their progress steady and unhurried. At ports and river junctions, records were reviewed and measures confirmed. These moments reinforced consistency across regions, aligning distant communities through shared standards rather than direct oversight. With increased movement came greater need for trust across unfamiliar boundaries. Systems of value supported this trust by providing continuity. A measure recognized in one settlement carried meaning in another. A seal impressed far away was accepted without question. This acceptance did not arise from authority alone, but from repetition. Each successful exchange reinforced confidence, allowing networks to extend further with each passing season. Yet these networks remained sensitive to change. A single disrupted route could shift patterns for years. Environmental shifts altered availability, forcing communities to rely more heavily on stored value or substitute goods. In response, systems of exchange adjusted quietly, absorbing strain without collapse. Flexibility proved essential, ensuring that value remained a tool for stability rather than a source of tension. As exchange widened, its influence reached beyond material needs. News traveled alongside goods, carried by traders who spoke of distant conditions, harvests, and customs. These accounts shaped expectations and planning, linking economic awareness to broader understanding of the world. Value thus became intertwined with knowledge, guiding decisions not only about trade, but about movement and cooperation. This steady circulation continued, expanding outward without urgency, preparing the ground for deeper transformations still to come. As the web of exchange grew denser, it began to shape the landscapes it touched. Paths widened through repeated passage. Riverbanks developed small landings, and familiar stopping places gained subtle markers of use. stones arranged for seating, posts worn smooth by rope, shaded areas cleared of brush. These changes were not planned in advance. They emerged gradually, guided by habit and necessity, reflecting the steady presence of movement across long spans of time. Value followed these traces, flowing where people already knew how to travel. Within settlements, the influence of distant exchange appeared quietly. New materials arrived and were incorporated without spectacle. A different weave of cloth, a metal of unfamiliar color, a tool shaped according to another tradition, all entered daily life slowly, evaluated for usefulness rather than novelty. Their acceptance depended less on origin than on compatibility with existing systems of measure and trust. When an item could be weighed, counted, or compared reliably, it found a place. These interactions encouraged subtle standardization. Measures became more consistent, not through decree, but through mutual adjustment. A weight used in one region was refined to match another. A measure of volume was reshaped slightly to align with common understanding. Over time, these small corrections accumulated, smoothing differences across wide areas. Exchange became easier, calmer, and less prone to confusion, supported by shared expectations rather than enforcement. Travelers adapted to these conditions by carrying fewer bulky goods and more portable representations of value. Metals cut into measured pieces, standardized weights, and recognizable seals allowed exchange to occur with less negotiation. These items moved easily through hands and across distances, enabling trade without prolonged discussion. Their presence did not replace trust. It supported it, offering reassurance in unfamiliar settings. Environmental awareness remained central. Routes adjusted seasonally. Exchanges slowed or paused when conditions required. In times of scarcity, value shifted toward preservation rather than circulation. Communities relied more heavily on stored resources, drawing upon the systems developed earlier. When abundance returned, exchange resumed without urgency, guided by the same calm principles that had sustained it before. The human element remained constant throughout these changes. Exchange was still carried out by individuals who observed, listened, and responded to context. Conversations remained brief and practical. Disputes were resolved through reference rather than argument. The presence of shared measures reduced misunderstanding, allowing interaction to proceed smoothly, even between those who did not share language or custom fully. As these networks matured, they formed a quiet foundation for wider connection. Regions once isolated now participated in a shared rhythm of movement, linked through goods that traveled farther than most people ever would. Value acted as a bridge, connecting landscapes and communities through steady, dependable exchange. This gentle expansion continued, reaching a point where the circulation of value influenced not only movement and trade, but the very way communities understood their place within a larger world, leading onward into the final portion of this unfolding layer. As these networks reached their furthest extent, exchange settled into a state of quiet familiarity. What had once required careful explanation now unfolded almost instinctively. Measures were recognized at a glance. Weights felt correct in the hand. The presence of certain materials carried understood meaning without the need for words. Value had become embedded not only in systems, but in habit, shaping expectations through long repetition rather than instruction. In many regions, the movement of exchange followed cycles rather than linear growth. Certain routes were active only at specific times of year, opening and closing in response to weather and resource availability. This rhythm encouraged patience. Goods were not expected immediately, but in their proper season. The delay itself became part of the system, reinforcing the understanding that value moved according to natural limits rather than desire alone. Settlements adapted their spaces to accommodate this flow. Storehouses expanded gradually, docks were reinforced, and resting places became more defined. Yet these changes remained modest, aligned with practical need rather than ambition. Exchange did not seek to dominate the landscape, it adapted to it. The result was a network that felt organic, shaped as much by terrain and climate as by human intention. Within this expanded world, value began to influence perception as well as practice. Communities became aware of their position within larger patterns of movement. Distant regions were no longer abstract ideas, but places connected through tangible exchange. This awareness fostered a sense of continuity across space, reducing isolation without erasing local identity. Each community retained its customs while participating in a shared framework of value. Despite this widening reach, exchange remained vulnerable. Disruption always lingered at the edges. Storms, environmental shifts, or social change could slow movement significantly. Yet the systems developed over generations absorbed these challenges with resilience. They contracted when necessary, expanded when possible, and endured without collapse. Their strength lay in flexibility, not scale. As this phase draws gently to a close, the movement of value appears less as a force of transformation and more as a steady presence, supporting life, enabling cooperation, and shaping connection without demanding attention. It prepared the ground for reflection rather than further expansion, inviting consideration of what these systems ultimately meant beyond their practical use. From this outward-reaching layer, attention now turns inward once more, toward the enduring patterns these early forms of money left behind, patterns that continue to shape human thought, behavior, and shared experience long after the roots themselves have faded into memory. As the wide paths of exchange settle into quiet memory, the movement of value slows once more. The routes traced by footsteps and currents remain, but their urgency fades, leaving behind patterns that are less visible yet deeply ingrained. What began as a practical response to storage, trust, and coordination has grown into something woven into thought itself. From measured grain to weighed metal, value has shaped not only how communities interacted, but how they understood balance, obligation, and continuity. With the outward journey complete, attention turns inward, toward reflection on what these early systems left behind in the long rhythm of human life. Across centuries, the earliest forms of money dissolved into everyday expectation. People no longer paused to consider the marks on tablets or the weight of metal as remarkable innovations. They became background elements of life, as familiar as tools or language. Yet beneath this familiarity, they quietly shaped behavior. Decisions about labor, cooperation, and planning increasingly relied on abstract measures rather than immediate circumstance. This shift did not alter human nature, but it refined how intention was expressed through action. Value encouraged foresight. Communities learned to think beyond the present moment, guided by records that stretched into the future. planning harvests, organizing labor, and preparing for uncertain seasons became calmer processes, supported by accumulated knowledge rather than instinct alone. This change introduced a gentle form of patience, allowing individuals to endure temporary scarcity with confidence that balance would return. In this way, early money fostered a relationship with time itself, smoothing its sharp edges through anticipation and structure. At the same time, abstraction introduced distance. Exchange no longer required personal familiarity. Trust could be placed in systems rather than individuals. While this expanded cooperation, it also softened direct connection. Relationships grew more predictable but less intimate. Communities adapted by reinforcing shared values through ritual, custom, and law, ensuring that systems of value remained aligned with collective well-being rather than drifting into isolation. The presence of money-like systems also influenced perception of fairness. Consistent measures became symbols of justice. To weigh correctly was to act rightly. This association extended into moral thought, linking balance in exchange with balance in behavior. Over generations, these ideas shaped social expectations, embedding economic principles within ethical frameworks. Fairness became something that could be measured, even if imperfectly, grounding abstract ideals in tangible practice. Memory played a crucial role in sustaining these patterns. Records preserved obligations beyond individual lifespans, allowing communities to maintain continuity through change. Yet memory also softened rigidity. When systems failed or needed adjustment, communities relied on shared understanding to adapt rather than collapse. This balance between structure and flexibility became one of the enduring legacies of early money, a reminder that systems serve people best when they remain responsive rather than absolute. As these reflections deepen, the narrative continues toward broader connections between value and meaning, exploring how early money influenced belief, identity, and the quiet continuity of human culture. As generations passed, value settled more deeply into the inner landscape of human thought. What had once required careful explanation became instinctive. People learned to sense proportion, to recognize balance not only in exchange, but in daily conduct. The act of measuring grain or weighing metal subtly mirrored the desire to measure effort, fairness, and responsibility. In this way, systems of value shaped not only economies, but habits of mind. Communities began to understand themselves through these patterns. Collective identity formed around shared standards, shared expectations, and shared rhythms of exchange. To belong meant to recognize the same measures, to trust the same symbols, to move within the same quiet agreements. These systems offered reassurance in an uncertain world, creating a sense of order that extended beyond the visible landscape into the realm of thought and expectation. Over time, value also influenced how people understood success and stability. Accumulation was possible, but it remained constrained by social expectation. Wealth that disrupted balance was viewed with caution. Enduring respect flowed instead toward those who managed resources steadily, distributing rather than displaying. This preference reinforced continuity, anchoring value to responsibility rather than excess. Even as societies grew more complex, this early association lingered, shaping ideals of leadership and stewardship. The abstraction of value allowed stories to emerge, stories that explained fortune, loss, and effort through shared symbols. These narratives softened uncertainty, offering explanations that connected personal experience to larger patterns. A poor harvest was not merely a failure, but part of a cycle. A surplus was not simply gain, but a responsibility. Through such interpretations, money-like systems became intertwined with meaning, shaping how communities understood change itself. At the same time, the presence of abstract value invited reflection on limits. No measure could capture every need. No record could predict every outcome. Communities learned, often quietly, that systems required interpretation as much as adherence. When circumstances shifted, adaptation mattered more than precision. This understanding preserved humanity within structure, ensuring that systems of value remained tools rather than masters. As writing spread and records multiplied, the original intimacy of exchange faded further into the background. Yet its influence remained visible in the continued emphasis on balance, trust, and proportion. These principles traveled forward through centuries, reappearing in new forms: coins, contracts, and institutions, each shaped by the same foundational impulse to coordinate human effort calmly and reliably. These reflections lead gently toward a final consideration: how the earliest forms of money, born from grain and clay, continue to echo in modern life. Not as relics, but as enduring patterns that still shape human behavior, often unnoticed. As the long movement of history continues, the earliest forms of money dissolve almost completely into the background of human life. Grain tallies and clay tablets no longer remain, yet the patterns they introduced persist. The habit of measuring effort, of planning beyond the present moment, and of trusting shared systems continues quietly, shaping choices without demanding attention. These patterns become so familiar that they appear natural, even inevitable, though their origins lie in very simple needs met with patience and care. Value, once tied directly to survival, gradually becomes a lens through which people understand stability and uncertainty. Decisions are weighed not only in material terms, but in anticipation of future consequences. This orientation toward balance influences how communities approach cooperation, conflict, and change. Even as forms of money grow more complex, their foundation remains rooted in the same impulse: to create continuity in a world shaped by fluctuation. Across cultures and centuries, this impulse repeats with remarkable consistency. Wherever people settle, systems of value emerge alongside them, adapting to local conditions while reflecting shared human tendencies. They encourage foresight, enable cooperation beyond immediate familiarity, and offer structure without erasing flexibility. Though often discussed in terms of economy, these systems also shape emotion and expectation, guiding how people interpret success, loss, and responsibility. At times, value becomes overextended, abstracted beyond its grounding in lived experience. When this occurs, communities are reminded, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly, of the importance of balance. Periods of adjustment follow, restoring connection between measure and meaning. These cycles mirror the earliest rhythms of exchange, reinforcing the idea that systems endure best when they remain aligned with human scale. In this sense, the story of money is not a tale of invention, but of reflection. It reflects how people relate to time, to one another, and to the uncertainty of the future. From clay tablets impressed by careful hands to the quiet expectations embedded in modern life, the same underlying patterns continue to guide behavior. They do so not through command, but through familiarity, shaping thought through repetition rather than force. The origins of money remind us that even the most abstract systems arise from everyday experience. They are shaped by hands that measure grain, voices that negotiate calmly, and communities that value trust as much as efficiency. These origins remain present, not as artifacts, but as enduring habits woven into the fabric of human life. As this long reflection settles into stillness, the earliest moments of exchange return quietly to memory. Grain stored with care, marks pressed into clay, and weights balanced patiently all fade into the distance, yet their influence remains. They echo in the calm structures that support cooperation and continuity across generations. With the story now at rest, these patterns linger softly, like impressions left on the earth after many seasons, present, familiar, and quietly enduring.